Welcome to the Muscle Expert Podcast with Ben Pakulski, one of the world's top professional bodybuilders, an expert on human performance and mindset mastery. Ben dives deep to deliver the strategies of the top experts to upgrade your body, mind, muscle, strength, performance, biochemistry, and how to become the upgraded modern man.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Muscle Expert Podcast. I am your host, Ben Pakulski, and today we're going to dive deeper into nutrition, specifically demystifying anxiety. So many of us, whether we care to admit it or not, are living a life with low-level anxiety, or maybe it's high-level anxiety. And this is a huge issue for women, and believe it or not, it's a huge issue for men as well, even though we try not to admit it. A lot of us are running away from our anxiety using things like marijuana, CBD, exercise, and food to numb ourselves from our feelings. And not that this is a conversation about feelings, this is a conversation about the hard evidence and the conversation around nutrition and how to mitigate how we feel and how to really get our body working well. So if you're someone who's having issues with your brain, if you're someone who's having issues with your gut, or just improving your body composition, this is going to be a conversation you absolutely love. Today's guest, Ali Miller, is the author of the Anti-Anxiety Diet, which is out today. So go out and get it up. Go get it, because I think this was an amazing conversation. This lady is an absolute wealth of knowledge and information around how to optimize your nutrition to not just get rid of anxiety, but to how to optimize your gut, how to optimize your mind, your HPA axis, all things you guys know that I drive people to all the time. If you just want to live an amazing life in a great body, you have to learn how to optimize these things. So without further ado, Ali's going to tell us about how to remove inflammation, how to restore the microbiome, how to rebuild the gut, how to restore micronutrients, how to rebound the adrenals, and how to rebuild neurotransmitters. We also get into stuff around SSRIs, around executive function, and a whole bunch of really, really compelling, interesting topics around nutrition. So I hope you enjoy the show. Without further ado, here is Ali Miller. Teach me about the benefits of ketogenic diet on the brain and how it's influencing GABA. And I didn't know any about that. If you could tell me about that, that'd be awesome.
Back in the 40s, when we discovered the ketogenic diet and its tool on epilepsy, it being a tool on epilepsy, one of the primary mechanisms of action is that ketones sit on our excitatory synapses. And so they do a couple different things. When we use the state of ketogenic diet, we reduce free radical exposure because we don't have as much oxygenation as far as demand in the brain, and oxidative damage. So that's a huge element on a kind of mellowing out impact. We also are going to have an influence on our GABA receptors, and GABA is an inhibitory compound when we're talking about anxiety. Even more, I think, of a star of the show than serotonin is, because of pharmacological interventions with selective serotonin reuptake drugs, SSRIs. Serotonin is thought of as, the big anti-anxiety and antidepressant. But on an anxiety, especially when we're talking about panic attack or physiological influence like tremors, shortness of breath, tightness in the chest, a lot of those classic physiological influences, a lot of that has a lot more to do with GABA. And so GABA is also the same neurotransmitter that we think of with Parkinson's disease. So when someone has uncontrolled rigidity or tremors, it's because they're not getting their optimized GABA receptor function. So the mechanism of ketones as a GABAergic, or working with GABA receptor optimization, is one of the ways that it actually can reduce excitatory impulse, being an inhibitory compound. So it actually counteracts as an inhibitory compound to create that systemic mellow, if you will, and then can actually interfere, because it can cross our synapses. It can actually interfere with those excitatory signals and create that grounding effect on a very extreme excitatory level. So it's a really phenomenal influence. And then there's when I'm talking about food as medicine, it's always a double-edged sword. The other part that's beneficial of keto for an anti-anxiety tool is that we're not having irregular blood sugar levels. So there's the both actual therapeutic effect of the production of ketones on the blood-brain barrier and neurotransmitters. And then there's actually a mechanism of creating balanced blood sugar, not having those mountains and valleys of irregularity. And that's where we see, even in like the pediatric population, favorable influence of just going low glycemic alone and managing blood sugar to help with concentration, focus, behavior.
Very, very fascinating. So, like I said, just prior to starting, I have some clients who are experiencing this low level anxiety. What would be some of the dietary interventions that you're going to recommend? So we're trying to get them on the ketogenic diet. So when I start a dietary intervention with somebody, oftentimes, not with everybody, but if you're trying to lose fat, one of the first things I do, and you'll probably understand, is get them fat adapted, right? Like get their body using fat for fuel as rest, at rest, and then then we manipulate carbohydrates. And a lot of these people that are going into a fat adaptation phase, even if they're in low level ketosis, they're still experiencing some degree of what they perceive as low level anxiety, which is increasing their likelihood of breaking the ketogenic diet. They're going to go eat some carbohydrates because typically that is what makes them feel better. So any suggestions on how we're going to mitigate that effect?
And I couldn't agree with you enough, Ben, as far as this is not my phrases, but it's something I've repeated and heard somewhere, is that, exercise is the most underutilized antidepressant and food is the most abused anti-anxiety, right? So that is, there's this, I think a lot of it's behavioral and this kind of mindless nervous munching that we go to food and often we go to high sugar paired with high fat, looking for that dopamine peak, that food coma. People perceive that food coma to have anti-anxiety effects. And you do get a dopamine response in the brain when you have sugary foods, especially sugar paired with fat. But the problem is that we don't create more dopamine from those types of foods. So my whole idea is, when you look at functional integrated medicine, we're always looking at what is the root cause of dysfunction. Why is the symptom being experienced, not just what symptom is being experienced. Right. So why is the symptom being experienced, and how can we address that from the root cause to create more of an even-keeled, optimized function for sustainable results, not just these constant whack-a-mole, right? Where it's like, you got this and you got to pop over there.
Fix it, right.
So my book uses a 6R approach. And so we go through different entry points that can have chicken and egg relationship with drivers of anxiety, as well as when that mechanism is off, how anxiety influences that mechanism to perpetuate. So it's a little bit of a slippery slope there. And we go from removing inflammatory foods. And so someone that's keto, for instance, may have leaky gut, and they may have leaky gut from use of birth control. They may have leaky gut from consuming chlorine in their tap water. They may have leaky gut just from stress alone, actually, can deplete our secretory IgA or our gut integrity, that lining there. So even someone that's eating a perfect quote unquote diet, if they're type A and obsessing about their diet and high stress, that could be driving leaky gut. So it's wild.
So is that what your perspective or what you propose is the thing that's influencing most people's anxiety is gut issues? Like where are most people getting there? Obviously, the perceived stress, their high levels of cortisol, their high levels of, maybe the depleted serotonin, maybe it's depleted GABA. What are the proposed causes internally in this HPA axis that are leading people down this path of, having massive amounts of societal anxiety?
Yeah. So, that's one proposed mechanism is inflammation in the gut.
Yeah.
And like I said, that's one that sometimes we can see get worse with people when they go keto. And it may be because they have an immunological inflammatory reaction to a food they're eating more of. So, we were just jiving about how we both really dig olive oil. I've had people that have had an off the charts inflammatory response to olive oil, and it's an otherwise healthy, nourishing food. But our immune system is our own surveillance system of the body, and it determines what's friend and foe. And based on that gut integrity, if our immune system doesn't like that compound, we fire off inflammatory mediating chemicals, and those cross the blood-brain barrier, and then those can interfere with neurotransmitter function and receptor function and the communication on the synapses with things like acetylcholine that kind of drives those signals. So that's just one. And then I go into the microbiome. That's an entire other element within also gut, but that plays a role. We look at also our actual micronutrient status, someone that has mineral imbalances, for instance, like a copper.
Are you testing all these things? Like, are you testing sensitivities? Are you testing microbiome? Are you testing food or micronutrient deficiencies?
I do. I don't start with all, because I always say data is only as sexy as the application of it, right?
Sure.
So like you come in with like a file cabinet of functional labs, you just threw $5,000 on the table, and you're still at that same whack-a-mole space, right? So my job as a hopefully good practitioner is to be the detective of the body, to say, okay, Ben, yeah, leaky gut's a total thing. Yeah, microbiome's a total thing. But for you, I'm going to start with adrenals as a influence from exercise demand and past history and stimulants and this and that and that. And this is where I'm going to harness it on for you. Or maybe you've already healed that process. You've already working that slope. I'm going to look at micronutrients, because although you're doing XYZ, I see trends of insomnia. I see trends of hair loss. So the way my book works is there's a quiz at the end of each chapter, and all of the relevant 6 R's, which is removing inflammation, restoring your microbiome, repairing your gut lining, restoring your micronutrients. There must be another different R I used in there. And then rebounding your adrenals, and then rebalancing your neurotransmitters. Everyone's going to have a different entry point. So a mama that just carried a baby and breastfed is probably going to start with micronutrient depletion, right? Because they're just like creating a being. An exerciser might start there. They might start in adrenals. And so they're all important in all of those areas, and we can jive on each of them, but all of those areas independently have mechanisms that can drive HPA axis dysfunction. And then on the latter end, again, HPA dysfunction can drive imbalance in those areas.
Very fascinating. So let's definitely walk through all those R's, because every one of them sounds like you're talking my language. So you start wherever you think is going to be maybe most prominent. Okay.
So I kind of started the piece of that, removing inflammation. And so, we talked about everyone having unique foods. And again, the idea that, and that's what I love about food as medicine, is there are kind of macroscopic concepts of foods that are anti-inflammatory or pro-inflammatory. And so I do remove 5 primary pro-inflammatory foods. So gluten is out, corn is out. We pull dairy out in all forms for anxiety, specifically because casein, there's a lot of research on caseomorphin. And the casein, which is the protein other than whey in dairy, can cross the blood-brain barrier and have a big influence with manic bipolar disorder. Also, because it interferes with opioids, it can drive addictive tendencies, aggression, and anger. So we pull out dairy in all forms. And then at week 6, I allow people to start to bring in casein-free options like a ghee, and then grass-fed whey that's non-denatured. And they strategically test those to kind of see if they have an influence. And then the other primary removals are going to be sugar in all forms. And that's when I present ketosis and just removing excessive carbs. So I bring people down to 30 grams of carbs as a foundational platform. And then the last R is...
That's net carbs? Or is that total? Total. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't really play until you, and again, now me daily living in ketosis and testing my blood, I can go upwards of 45, depending on my activity level. I can even go upwards of, some men can go upwards of 60 and still totally be in deep ketosis without using like MCT oil and things that are going to drive ketone production. But I start at total 30 just so that the body really knows that fat is the primary fuel. And then as it becomes a lifestyle and as you really recalibrate your palate, then I allow it to be more intuitive with getting the residual carbs from your nut butters, your avocado, your non-starchy vegetables and such. So
awesome. So sugar, and the last one is?
And then the last one is soy. So I pull out all of those foundationally, and then I do in that removing inflammatory foods chapter, like I said, present the ketogenic diet, which we give more information on with the application part of the book, but presenting that in the sense, like we just said, how both on blood sugar metabolism, there's a 3 times more likelihood of mental illness when we have blood sugar levels tested by hemoglobin A1C over 6.2. There's a 3 times more likelihood of anxiety and depression. And so we're both removing that as a risk factor with the ketogenic diet, but then we're getting those benefits that we discussed earlier as well. Mm-hmm. And then I present to them, if they're not getting outcomes and still dealing with inflammatory symptoms, that then they may want to look deeper down the rabbit hole into like an AIP elimination diet, or doing a inflammatory food panel test. And I use in my clinic the MRT test by Oxford Biomed. I really like that panel.
It's a great panel. I've done it a few times. Absolutely applicable for sure.
Yeah. So that's all just within the remove. And then the next R is restoring your microbiome. And the microbiome is, I mean, that's a whole episode of itself. It's just a fascinating.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, because we know so little, we speculate so much, and restoring it sounds like the impossible task. But I'd love to hear your approach.
So again, a lot of people, we know that good gut bacteria, when we're in a balanced state of gut bacteria, it's called symbiosis. It's a symbiotic environment. We call it dysbiosis if the gut bacteria is in an imbalanced state. And about 80 to 90% of our neurotransmitters are manufactured in the GI tract. So serotonin being one of them, dopamine is also produced in the gut. Dopamine has a two-part impact because it's produced by the adrenal glands primarily, but then manufactured in the gut. So there's a component of kind of both ends there. And then our GABA also has a huge influence by the gut, and that's that mellowing out neurotransmitter as well. We find in a dysbiotic environment, especially if an individual has a pathogenic strain of gut bacteria or yeast overgrowth like candidiasis or candida, that the individual actually manufactures higher amounts of epinephrine, which is the fight or flight stress chemical that is, layman's terms, adrenaline. So again, there's kind of this chicken and egg, right? So if you have bad bacteria overgrowth, you're driving chronic anxiety because the body's just like, I don't like this. I don't like what's going on. I'm stressed out. I got to get rid of this stuff. So it's supposed to be with that alarm mechanism telling the immune system to upregulate its function, its natural killer cells and all of that kind of surveillance activity. In a sound state, we're making more of those feel-good neurotransmitters. And then to add like another crazy element to this, stress alone can sterilize the microbiome. So we've seen in research studies with mice, for instance, where they've done biome assessments pre and post exposure to electrical shock, and then removing the electrical shock, but maintaining the stressor. One study was removing the mice from its mother, but being able to see the mother. And so there was this emotional distress. I mean, I guess you could say emotional for the mouse. It was a stress that was non-physical, and other than the physical separation. And they found that the lactobacillus and bifido, which are the two most well-known in research beneficial microbiome contributors, which manufacture serotonin and GABA, mind you, those mellower outers, were completely sterilized to nil. And that secretory IgA level went super skyrocket high, which showed that the body was in a distress battle mode, and then plummeted to nothing, which shows at that point a leaky gut. So, just being stressed from our jobs, from our external environment, from intermarital stress, whatever it is, that alone can like drill holes in our gut and throw our gut bacteria off. It's pretty wild.
Hey guys, I interrupt the podcast with Ali Miller to bring you a special message from Four Sigmatic. So you guys know I've been getting behind Four Sigmatic because I love them, I use them, and I think you should too. So Ali and I actually talk a little bit about cordyceps in this episode. She's using it as an adaptogen. I've actually never used it for that reason before. So an adaptogen, as she mentions, is something that if you tend to be really, really stressed, can bring you down. If you tend to be really, really sluggish, can bring you up. That's actually the definition of an adaptogen, meaning if you're low, it'll bring you higher. If you're high, it'll bring you down. Just to make you feel great. I love Four Sigmatic. I use cordyceps all the time. Like I've told you, I've used it for its endurance benefits for anybody looking to improve your cardiovascular condition. I'm also, as we speak about reishi, if you haven't ever used reishi, if you ever get sick, if you're ever having a low immune system, if you're ever stressed, if you're ever burning the candle at both ends, reishi is an absolute necessity to add to your repertoire because it's going to be a great immune booster. It's literally the type of thing where I'll take 3 grams when I feel myself getting a little run down. If I didn't sleep well for a couple of days, if I'm traveling, if I'm on airplanes, I'm going to throw a little bit of reishi in there and feel like an absolute rock star within 24 hours. Literally, it's replaced vitamin C in my diet. Some people have their, go-to for the immune protocol. And for me, that's reishi, which you can find at foursigmatic.com/muscle. And if you use the code muscle at foursigmatic, you get 15% off now. Enjoy the rest of the show with Ali Miller. So how do people know? How do they know that they have these dysbiosis? How do they know that they maybe have some bacterial overgrowth in there?
So usually one good way to do, I do something called a probiotic challenge in my clinic, which is a cheaper kind of first line step versus doing a stool test right away. I love doing stool panels, but I always say you can first try to plow the fields preliminarily. If you know you're in a bad place, at this point you could probably do a broad cleanse of sorts. So what we do with a probiotic challenge is I start you with a 50-50 blend of 15 billion colony-forming units of a lacto and bifido probiotic. It's called Baseline Restore Probiotic. And so you take one at bed for 3 nights. And first I have you do some base measurements being off of all probiotic foods and supplements for 2 weeks. So you measure your waist circumference around the belly button. And then some people get bloating above or below, more like SIBO would be above. Just generalized dysbiosis could be below. So I have them measure their circumference at rise and rest. And the reason for that is usually, and this is why keto carnivore works so well for a lot of people who have dysbiosis, usually if you have dysbiosis, the bacteria eats what you eat, and then you get that fermentation, distension, and bloat throughout the day as you eat prebiotic fibers, as you eat anything that the bugs can get they don't have hands, but their mouths on. And so what we're looking for is also, if you have severe dysbiosis and you strategically go from 15 billion for 3 days up to 30 billion for 3 days, so taking 2 pills, 3 pills, and 4 pills, all the way up to 60 billion when you're getting into that 10th day and up. If you see that the abdomen becomes flatter, if you see bowel motility and formation becomes improved, then you may just be dysbiotic due to sterility. And you may be one of the lucky ones that can just bring in a targeted probiotic at a higher dosage, and that may be enough to balance out your biome. If as you go up that bell curve and you add the good troops and you get worse, then you're trying to induce a good army to an over battlefield of bad troops. And then you need to get in there and plow the fields. And so I do talk about, I have an ebook actually on my website called Beat the Bloat, and it has a 6-week cleanse. So I have people always start with the probiotic challenge first to determine if they need that. And that's just kind of a foundational cleanse that I do with things like berberine, oil of oregano, lemon balm, caprylic acid. And then we use a phagocytotic bacteria that eats away at the die-off process.
What's that one? I'm not familiar with that.
I have a supplement line, so they're all private label named. It's called GI Cleanup. But phagocytotic strains in general have the ability, so we call macrophages are one of our ways that our cells can basically clean up in the body. And so phagocytotic bacteria strains are the eaters and the cleaners of the gut.
I thought I was just asking for if you know what the strain is.
So it's called GI Reset, and it is a form of a lactobacillus bacteria.
Very, very cool. So we wrapped up our restore the microbiome. Let's move on. I was going to pull you off track a little bit, but I don't want to go off too many tangents. I'll save these questions for the end. So moving on to our third R.
Sure. So the third R then is, once you have removed the drivers of inflammation, and once you have hopefully created a nice synergistic environment in the biome, then we want to start to really rebuild the house. So you can't rebuild a house that's on fire, and you can't rebuild a house that doesn't have the builders to line and create the foundation between the bricks, which is the microbiome. Mm-hmm. So now we start talking about gut integrity and gut lining, which is very intimately, like I said, connected to those first 2 R's. And this really is a big emphasis on things like glutamine. And glutamine can be very controversial when we talk about anxiety, because glutamate can have some excitatory properties. So we think of like MSG, monosodium glutamate, and Chinese diet syndrome, where some people get migraines or can get anxiety or insomnia from exposure to MSG. And glutamate as a conversion can be classified as an excitatory neurotransmitter. But glutamine, which is the amino acid, can convert into GABA, which is that mellower outer. And glutamine can also contribute to build glutathione. These are a lot of big words, but glutathione is the granddaddy antioxidant in the liver. And so that's really going to help with reducing oxidative damage and stress. And I'm a big fan of glutamine. We know it plays a huge role with muscle maintenance as well. And can definitely, when people have sore muscles, that's usually kind of my go-to first line of defense before BCAA is looking at, let's see where your glutamine's at. Let's get some bone broth going. Let's work with some cabbage. Those are both very rich foods. So cooking down cabbage in ghee or coconut oil and braising it down with some bone broth is a really great restoring dish. And then use of bone broth and gelatin, very fantastic for gut restoration. And this is all really important because then that sets us up for the next R, which is our restoring our micronutrients, and you absorb your nutrients along the GI tract. So if you are a holy mess, you don't have that playing field for actually utilization of the nutrients that you're consuming in your diet.
Wonderful. So as far as, coming back a little bit to rebuilding the gut, glutamine, so collagen and glycine, any type of consideration, because you did mention chlorine, and I'm wondering what your considerations are around removing that, because is there a specific water filter you advocate? Because I think that's a huge thing, right? Everyone's drinking low quality water loaded with chlorine, even consuming it through showering. Like I know that's, or being in pools. I know all these things are massively influencing our nervous system, they're influencing our gut.
Yes.
What are some of your strategies around removing chlorine?
Yes. So I think the Berkey filter is a good option for a home affordable option. And I like reverse osmosis. There is for whole house filters. We do that in our household. And then I still order, it's called Mountain Valley. It's the glass globes. Yeah. It's such good water. I mean, water is life. And I'm like, this is my security blanket. Everywhere I go, I bring my own water bottle, and I'm really into optimized hydration status. So I'm kind of into them for the taste and the purity. And then household, I just go for reverse osmosis.
So I have a Berkey, but I found that the water tastes like plastic. So I don't know if yours is the same as mine, that I have my filters sit in the water. So the filters are made of plastic and they sit in the water. So if you fill it too high, it ends up tasting like plastic. I'm like that. I guess they didn't make the Berkey to make it plastic free, but they made it to remove toxins. But I was like, gosh, if they would just, if the president of Berkey happens to be listening, or somebody happens to know them, hey, if somebody happens to know them, really, like, why do I want to put plastic into my, literally, so we have it, but I don't know if we taste that in the water.
And that's the drama about like all the fridge filters, like if I go visit, oh, my brother's not listening. If I go visit family or whatever, and you're like at their house and you're like, I find I just always just go and buy my Mountain Valley.
You have to have a case of Mountain Valley in the car at all times.
For sure. Sponsor looking. But no, and then, we, in that same chapter, NSAIDs are another huge one, and PPIs. So very standardly used over-the-counter, seemingly safe drugs, Aleve, Advil. NSAIDs are your non-steroid anti-inflammatories. So will say very clearly on the bottle, warning, will cause GI distress and gastric bleeding if used chronically. And unfortunately, I work with so many clients that take 2 Advils every day. And it may be because they're eating an inflammatory diet. And, if they can get to those, again, foundational wise, in the interim, I may put them on a higher dose turmeric blended with turmeric oil, which can have anti-inflammatory support. I may bump up their EPA. So there's mechanisms, again, we can modulate to reduce inflammation in that same setting. But we really need to get to the root of why they're in this chronic state of inflammation and how that destroys the gut.
I'd say 50% of my clients experience some type of chronic back pain. Like, if you're over 35, you're over 40, everyone has chronic back pain. And as soon as I introduce a morning practice around breathing, everyone's back pain goes away. And they're like, wow, I can't believe that something as simple as breathing has removed my back pain. So most people are like, hey, I need to take curcumin. I need to take, whatever it is, something anti-inflammatory. And I find, at least 90% of the time, if you introduce a deep, extended breathing session in the morning, so it can be 10 breaths, but if you're extending the inhalation exhalation cycle to where you're getting, 20, 30, 40 second inhalation, 20, 30 second exhalations, you can really change, one, the parasympathetic stress, two, the musculature around the rib cage and spine tends to loosen up and relax, and people just alleviate all their back pain. And this is something I've been doing for maybe a year or two with all my clients, and literally nobody has back pain anymore. They're just like, gosh, I didn't realize it was so easy. So for everybody listening, it's a simple practice where you're just extending your inhalation and exhalation cycles. So obviously, like I say, multiple benefits, right? Parasympathetic stimulus, as well as just changing the muscle. Because every time you take a deep breath in, you're extending the spine, and we're getting that extended spinal extension. You're also getting the expanded, intercostal muscles, and all the muscles that wrap around the diaphragm or wrap around the rib cage are going through a natural muscular rhythm, a natural muscular cycle, which should be relatively physiological. But as we age and we sit so much, our breathing patterns become so limited and so small that it restricts those muscles. So the nervous system doesn't go to those extended places. It's use it or lose it, right? So a lot of these mobility things can happen just something as simple as breathing.
Oh, and breath is the most dynamic way to harness the wild stallion of the brain. It actually will have an influence on our vagus nerve, which runs from the brainstem down through the colon. And yes, I use in my book the 4-7-8 breath by Dr. Andrew Weil, and I find that to be a really great tool too. And
tell me what that 4-7-8 what does that mean?
It's in for 4 through the nose, holding for 7, and whooshing like a for 8. So it's a 2-to-1 output to input. And doing cycles of that can really harness and shift you from sympathetic into parasympathetic. And that makes great sense, because excess epinephrine, which I referenced as that adrenaline, epinephrine can actually increase pain sensory and influence of pain. So there actually is a neurofeedback that we get as far as how we experience pain and actual levels of pain. And I see that a lot with PTSD clients that I work with. If I'm working with veterans, firefighters, a lot of men that have been under very severe trauma, their epinephrine is just off the charts, man. And we're just doing what we can to really harness and control that. And we find that chronic pain. I mean, a lot of these guys, unfortunately, are dealing with opioid addiction as well, because they've just been on pain medications for so long to work with that. And it's that signaling impact.
What are some of the basic strategies you're using for micronutrient replenishment? So which ones do you find tend to be common, if you can make that statement, tend to be common as far as things you want to address? And if you have any food strategies, or if you have any vitamin strategies?
Yes. So first I would start with B vitamins first and foremost. And so, like you go to drugstore, it's like a B complex for energy and stress. We know that B vitamins work very heavily as cofactors for our neurotransmitters, particularly B6. B6 is the most poignant cofactor that helps to activate something like 5-HTP into serotonin, or tyrosine into dopamine. So B6 is a really fabulous one that we look at ensuring is optimized, as well as pantothenate or B5, which can play a big role along with biotin when deficient in driving, anxiety, and depression. And then the B vitamins that can be methylated, so our B12 and our folate, there's a huge influence with anxiety, specifically with folate and MTHFR. And there's 2 gene influencers. So there's genetic polymorphisms, and what these basically are, we call them SNPs in the medical field. So single nucleotide polymorphisms. And a SNP is a predisposition. Basically, mom and dad give you your, 23 chromosomes each. And so you got your paired double helix DNA. And you can have a heterozygous or a homozygous SNP, hetero meaning only one mutated gene, homo meaning both mutated. And we're looking a lot in the last 10 years with pharmacotherapy on the influence of MTHFR and its role with building neurotransmitters, and specifically serotonin. And we do see a huge influence. And unfortunately, there's many people that don't fully understand the cycles. And so if someone has an MTHFR SNP, they may just give them boatloads of methylfolate. So Deplin is the pharmaceutical drug. That's a high dose. I believe it's 10 grams of methylfolate, super, super, super high, milligrams, excuse me, not grams. And I would put someone on 1 milligram potentially to start. And it's important to note that because, again, it's this American concept of just because you're low, it doesn't mean you need a shit ton to be better.
Yeah.
Because for many people that are MTHFR, they also have another gene called COMT. And MTHFR basically means both building and excreting. So if you are someone that has that genetic predisposition, you're going to have a hard time building serotonin. You're going to have a hard time excreting certain toxins in the body and metabolites. Now, if you're, I listed another one, and this might be going way too deep down the rabbit hole, but if you're COMT, this stands for catecholamine methyltransferase. And catecholamines are your stress responding chemicals. So if someone's MTHFR and also COMT, and we give them a boatload of methylfolate, they drive the wheel, they're building the serotonin, but they also get this damning effect of a buildup of that epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. And they can go into this beautiful mind, I call it, craze of mania, where their excitatory neurotransmitters are just on high alert. They start to have insomnia. They can get really bad estrogen dominance. So B vitamins are super important. It's really important to, generally speaking, use methylated forms of Bs because these are bioactive, but I like them in a moderate dosage unless you're going to do intensive investigative research on your SNPs. And if you are someone who has that COMT, then you need to bring in other players like SAMe, S-adenosylmethionine, to help to release that other wheel or the valve so you don't get that buildup of those stress chemicals. And then you need other things that support methylation beyond the B vitamins, things like glutathione, which I mentioned, which is a big antioxidant. We get this from avocado. We get this also from cumin, actually, a seasoning that we use in Mexican dishes and such, very potent dosage in cumin. And so methylation is one process that's nutritionally driven. And then we look at minerals as well. Zinc and calcium are two big minerals, and magnesium, the original chill pill. Those play a huge role as well. Yeah.
Do you have any dietary suggestions for magnesium, calcium, and zinc? Because,
sure.
I mean, everyone, you hear calcium, you automatically assume dairy, and we all know that dairy is not awesome. And zinc and magnesium are kind of those, we know approximately everything's kind of in green leafy vegetables, but any other obscure foods that you'd recommend that people consume?
Yeah, so zinc, my go-to is always eating more red meat and dark meat, and that's a great way to get B6 up as well. And I'm sure your listeners are a little more well-versed in this, but standard American diet of eating only muscle fibers first off, not getting the gamey, fattier cuts of meat, and not getting diversity is going to deplete us of the zinc for sure, and a lot of those B vitamins. And it throws off our methylation. We actually get high methionine. We don't get enough of the glycine and the proline. So bone broth is very helpful. Fattier cuts of meats and darker meat, more red meat. And if you're doing poultry, go for the thighs, go for the darker influences for the zinc. Pumpkin seeds are often discussed, but pumpkin seeds are actually dominant in copper. And for some people that deal with anxiety, they have a copper zinc imbalance. And there's actually a genetic disease called pyroluria, where we also get low B6, and that can interfere with mood stability. So pumpkin seeds could be used, but kind of dependent. And if you're using pumpkin as a flesh, that's one that can work really well. And vitamin C in our berries and our bell peppers are going to help to enhance the expression and utilization of zinc and the absorption. So adding acids, lemon juice, lime juice, and things like that, super helpful tools as well.
Any considerations? We talked about rebuilding the gut. We talked about restoring micronutrients. Any considerations around lectins and phytic acid? Any things you avoid?
So I actually, and my book doesn't go into that deep. And with AIP, I think it makes great sense. And phytates, first off, I mean, it's grain-free, gluten-free. You're going to get your highest lectins. You're going to get your highest lectins in gluten. So we're getting a little bit, I believe, nitty gritty when we're talking about lectins and zucchini and things like that. Now, for someone that has severe gut damage, yes, for a period of time, they may need to remove even the vegetable forms of lectins. And phytates, the best thing that you can do as far as that is soaking and sprouting your nuts and seeds, which are high in the phytic acid. And that can definitely help. But that's why in the AIP, we remove a lot of those foods completely, and then kind of slowly, strategically bring them in. So if you go through kind of my outline in the book and the gut lining chapter speaks to you the loudest, that would be an individual that I'd say, yes, you may want to take a break from lectins and phytates. But for other people, that may not be necessary.
Amazing. So moving on to the fifth R.
All right, where are we? Where am I? Adrenals, micronutrients. Yep. So we're talking about rebounding our adrenals. So both ends of the spectrum of whether we are in HPA axis burnout or in HPA axis excitatory over output, we can experience anxiety. And so even if we're in stage 3 or stage 4 adrenal insufficiency, or some people call that adrenal fatigue per se, I call it, the way I describe it is like, have you ever driven a car on a long road trip and you're like stir crazy tired? you're can't see straight and you're just so done, but then you can't fall asleep in your hotel. You're just tossing and turning. That's that like stressed and tired perpetual burn that we may not perceive as being fatigued, but we're so tired that we're in this excitatory refractory mode. Right. And that's because the feedback mechanisms of our HPA axis, so our hypothalamus and pituitary, are stimulators of our adrenals. So we have our ACTH, which is, the primary driver from our pituitary, and that gets a signal, likely it should, when cortisol is released from the adrenals to stop stimulating. And so our corticotropin releasing factor from our hypothalamus, our ACTH from the pituitary, those are the drivers of stimulating cortisol release. But in chronic fatigue syndrome or adrenal burnout, we don't have sufficient cortisol to give that negative feedback loop. So we continue with that perpetuating signal where we're just kind of wringing that sponge of adrenal depletion. And that's often where then we'll see on a neurotransmitter level, the medulla versus the cortex of the adrenals, which makes the dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine, goes on overdrive. So it's like, okay, cortisol's kind of pooped. I got to pick up the pace here. And we see excessive epinephrine. That's where we can deal with chronic pain. And that's also where we can deal with, when that cortisol gets super low, more bloating and distension from a stress mechanism, and leaky gut is definitely correlated as well, which takes us then back to the starting point. Mm-hmm. So it's really important to determine on an adrenal state if you need to support the adrenals on a glandular level and rebound them because you are at a level of burnout. And I like to, in clinic, run a 4-point salivary cortisol assessment. I also like to look at DHEA, which plays a huge role with our production of testosterone and our estrogen metabolism. And it also can pick up when cortisol is pooped out. And in excess, in women, excess DHEA can be an infertility driver that can be seen with PCOS. And so that's where keto actually, the process of ketosis metabolizes DHEA. And so that can be another favorable tool there. But for some people that are doing a keto diet,
maybe favorable for women, but not for men, it seems, right?
Right. Or, I mean, unless their DHEA is super high, I was just going to say, yeah. So for some people that are testing their blood and they're not getting ketone production and they're eating less than 30 grams of carbs, the next thing to look at is, do you have enough DHEA? And DHEA burnout can be just as important, if not more so, for whole body health than cortisol.
So looking at, kind of unpacking all that you just said right there, there's a lot going on there. So it seems as though what I'm looking for is some actual symptoms that people may experience to be able to identify themselves of having this, adrenal burnout, quote unquote. Is it just the type of thing where you're constantly under this low state of chronic stress to where your body's constantly turning out cortisol? It runs out of cortisol. Maybe it's the end of the day. All of a sudden you start feeling a little bit anxious. You start feeling a little bit overstressed. Is that what the type of symptom they'd be feeling?
That can be. And, often the cascade is to peak in the morning. So that's also why sometimes people will have higher fasting blood sugar because of that cortisol peak in the morning, that dawn phenomenon, as we call it. And cortisol does, generally speaking, cascade down in an L curve. So at the end of the day, especially someone that's demanding cortisol from exercise performance or from mental stress, so physiological or mental stress will demand cortisol. They will show up further depleted. And that can be one of the mechanisms that I mentioned, is that the epinephrine then tries to pick up the pace, and that can drive the anticipatory, excitatory distress on a mental and emotional level. Absolutely. So that can be a big component. And, symptom wise, some of the big things I look for is pain and overall lassitude. So just like a dull chronic pain. A fatigue and or brain fog, a lack of cognitive function and kind of executive performance, multitasking, and also borderline depression can be seen with, or severe depression can be seen. And that's why the new kid on the block as far as neurotransmitter drugs are the SSRIs, which work both with serotonin and norepinephrine also being made by the adrenals. So we're starting to, even in the mainstream medical model, acknowledge the state of the adrenals on regulating our mental health and our feeling of well-being, and that kind of Maslow's hierarchy of need. Adrenaline feels good, man, like driving a car fast, meeting a deadline, you get that good surge. And so when we're totally pooped and we don't have either, and we're just flatlined, that can drive a lot of muck and sludge to walk through on a daily basis.
Amazing. That was great. Thank you. Now, if the final R, you tell me what it was.
So then it's going specific into the nitty gritty of our neurotransmitters. And
that's right.
so we kind of preface the three that are made by the adrenals. So the norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine. And dopamine is the precursor. Dopamine is the building block that makes then norepinephrine, which then converts into epinephrine. But those are all made and produced by the adrenals, and should be regulated by, again, those signals of the HPA axis. And then there are our inhibitory neurotransmitters. So those are excitatory. Our inhibitory, or like landing gear for stress and anxiety, are predominantly our serotonin and our GABA. And then there are independent neurotransmitters. I mean, there's hundreds of them, but the ones that I focus on, glutamate being a signaling system, which we spoke to a little bit within the kind of gut lining support and muscle depletion. Glutamate tends to have a little bit more excitatory, but the fact that it can convert into GABA keeps it as a little bit of like a pendulum swinging neuroinfluencer. And then acetylcholine is really important because that's like the conductor of the signaling systems. It's actually classified as a neurotransmitter, but and I think, like, as far as foods, choline is richest in liver and egg yolk. And so acetylcholine is fabulous when we talk about things like MS, multiple sclerosis, or Parkinson's, when we're getting really big synapse gaps with our neurotransmitter function, and it's physiologically seen. Choline can be one of the biggest nutritional tools to really help with those conditions. And if we want to play safe and we don't want to do advanced testing, I generally recommend choline because I don't want to give someone, for instance, 5-HTP to just drive serotonin production for someone that may be moderate to high serotonin, and it might be their low GABA that they need, right? And so we're kind of shooting in the dark if we're just working with direct, what would be called precursors or building blocks, and those are all going to be amino acid derivatives.
Yeah.
And so I like to use more kind of broad scope in general. And another tool I really love is L-theanine. L-theanine's been something that I think in the biohacking world we've been speaking about for a while. It helps our alpha brain waves. So it helps to get the mind space into where we would be during concentration, meditation, REM cycle of sleep. L-theanine does have some GABA influence, but not direct. And it can be seen in matcha. And I think that's part of the buzz with the matcha movement as a health food. Mm-hmm.
So any recommendations on your part as far as how people can start to identify where their neurotransmitter excesses are, where their deficiencies are, just subjectively or objectively? Like, is there testing, or is it just some things we could do, answer some questions? I know I've had some recommendations in the past, but I'm curious if you have some.
Sure. So first line of defense is to ensure you're getting in. So my book does have within that chapter a identification of symptoms of deficiency and excess of each neurotransmitter. So you can kind of get, again, it's a very subjective world, to be fair, but it allows you to hopefully distinguish the variability between dopamine or glutamate or serotonin as far as how you're expressing in your body. Mm-hmm. And then I use a panel through Labrix. And so that's where I run both my salivary hormones and then also my neurotransmitters.
Neurotransmitters done via urine. Blood, via urine. Mm-hmm. So it's metabolites.
So it's a urinary metabolite assessment. Mm-hmm. And so I really like to use that. And then that's where I'll get more specific or strategic based on interventions as direct precursors. But the first line of defense is making sure you're getting enough protein in the diet and that your body is able to use the protein. So do you have enough stomach acid? Are you getting enough enzyme support to actually absorb the protein that you're taking? And gut integrity plays a role in that as well.
So this is maybe a little bit deep, but do you have any insights on how people can begin to differentiate the difference between low serotonin and low GABA?
So serotonin, generally speaking, we think of that like with the world of fibromyalgia. And so that would be also kind of one of those like overall lassitude aches. So fascia, the soft tissue in the body, is one of the big signs of low serotonin, and also insomnia tends to correlate more with serotonin. Whereas GABA, I generally think of impulse control when GABA is low. So like food cravings, I would go more for GABA. And I also think more about irritability, short fuse as a GABA depletion. White knuckle effect of actual physiological tension. So what I'm talking about, that is like, you're in traffic and you're like the Incredible Hulk hit, or like kind of the anger, irritability. That's usually more GABA too. Short fuse, irritability. Whereas serotonin, I think more of sleep patterns, and I think more of the muscular function and aches. GABA would be more of like tics. So even in kiddos that have like uncontrolled muscle tics, it's more neuromuscular direct impulse, whereas the serotonin is going to be more dull muscle aches, if that makes sense as a distinguishable.
Amazing. Now, in the middle of that, all that, you said something that caught my attention. You talked a little bit about executive function. Tell me about that and how you're able to help influence that.
So I do think that L-theanine is a great tool for executive function and cognitive function, because L-theanine, beyond getting us into that alpha brainwave space, it plays a role like a modulator for our signals in the brain. So even if we have excess epinephrine, L-theanine can actually help to bring that down. L-theanine can actually help to drive up serotonin. So it's a really safe place to make sure that our neurotransmitters are in an optimal area, and that's going to help with concentration and focus and cognitive function. The other thing that I work with a lot are adaptogens. So adaptogenic herbs are fabulous tools. So these are things like cordyceps and ashwagandha and rhodiola, ginseng, panax ginseng I love. And these are things that can provide us a concentration, focus, and stress resilience. So kind of put that bubble wrap against the superhuman demands that we may need to face. I'm a huge, I always say, like, my light joke is I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for adaptogens.
Ashwagandha is one of my favorites. I use it cyclically, but I absolutely love the way I feel when I take ashwagandha.
So yeah, I mean, all way beyond, I think we're often going for caffeine when we really need some adaptogen support. And, by true definition, an adaptogen is something that should have no upper toxicity limit. Their function will basically plateau, where many things do. CBD oil, same, L-theanine, a lot of things, they have a dose dependency and then they plateau, and you're not going to get more favorable outcomes from a higher dose. But a lot of those things that I just mentioned are going to be generally very, very safe. Now, with all herbs, everyone responds a little different. And some people, I find ginseng, of the most of them, to have maybe a little bit more prone towards like palpitations. So that's one that I watch for those that are really high anxiety if I'm selecting an adaptogen. But cordyceps, rhodiola, and ashwagandha tend to be very favorable.
Tell me a little bit about cordyceps.
So cordyceps are going to be derived Asia-derived caterpillar worm.
I'm familiar with the whole,
Yeah,
they're very interesting. And obviously they don't do the whole caterpillar worm thing anymore when they produce, right?
Right,
But it's
right.
very, very fascinating. But so what are some of the benefits you experience with, with cordyceps, or that you would expect to experience?
Well, a very grounding influence. So I like to use herbs in triads that are traditionally used. So whether it's a traditional Chinese blend or whether it's an Ayurvedic blend. So I usually will bring like reishi in, Ganoderma, which is a mushroom.
I love reishi.
Yes.
I love it.
So a lot of these reishi is going to have the benefit of like the immunomodulating properties as well as that parasympathetic benefit. And pairing that with cordyceps tends to be a really powerful tool. And that's where there's a lot of these now tea, coffee like products out there that are doing that. And that's the whole idea.
Four Sigmatic is one of the sponsors of the podcast. And
Awesome.
Honestly, anytime I start feeling like my immune system's run down, I throw some reishi in there, and like not a ton. It's like maybe 2 grams. And it goes away like almost instantly. There's 2 things I do that now that have become kind of my go-to. So I'll do 2 to 3 grams of reishi, and it feels like my immune system just gets a big kick in the pants. And I also do this biohacking tech called the NanoV. Have you familiar with the NanoV?
No.
It's awesome. So it's just structured water, and it's structured water vapor. And I take this stuff, and it feels like it mitigates all the oxidative stress from exercise, mitigates any type of brain fog. I sleep so much better. I wake up feeling completely rejuvenated. So if you haven't had a conversation or done any research into structured water, or like the 4th phase of water, easy water, it's the most fascinating thing. Gerald Pollack is the guy. I've had him on the podcast, and it's absolutely incredible to understand the function and potential with this 4th phase of water. It'll blow your mind.
Bells and whistles. Yeah, send me stuff.
yeah, I will for sure. It'll blow your mind. So fascinating. Cool. Like the implications, and now that they've discovered what this does and what the potential is as it decreases. I'll send you the podcast. It hasn't really started. I'll send it to you preemptively.
Cool.
You'll love it. Yeah, blow your mind. So fantastic. Gosh, there's so much more we can talk about. So the one thing that you briefly mentioned that I think would be very interesting for our female listeners to hear about is this 2-day a month or 4-day a month, 2 days at a time reintroduction of carbohydrates on a ketogenic diet. I'd like to know what you're using for carbohydrates, and tell us a little bit about the whys behind it.
Sure. So I like to also run a panel through SpectraCell that's called a cardiometabolic panel. It has all the elements of like a Berkeley heart test or Cleveland heart panel, but it also tests for leptin and adiponectin. And so I like to look at leptin levels in the blood for women, especially. Leptin is a hormone that we think of as helping with satiety, and it's one of the beneficial influences when we go keto. Just like with insulin resistance, we can have leptin resistance, and then we get leptin sensitivity. And when we get leptin sensitivity, I always say that generally speaking trends with like the keto high, where you want to like pick up a stranger off the street and give them a hug. We were just like, I have no hunger. I feel awesome. I'm invincible. I'm sleeping great. Everything's just like lined up and perfect. And that tends to go well for many people. Now, when women specifically are at an ideal body weight, well, first, a little bit more on leptin. So there's leptin receptors in our hypothalamus. And that's where the majority of them are. And that's where we get that satiation. Hypothalamic function plays a big role on our appetite regulation. And so it's a survival mechanism, truly. So there's leptin receptors in the hypothalamus. There's leptin receptors on our thyroid. So men and women have that action. But then there's leptin receptors on our ovaries for women. And for women, especially a lot of my clients that are 30 to 50-year-old, either, postpartum or going for fertility or going to get married, or their kids just went off to high school and they're resetting. A lot of them go into the kind of bulletproof coffee, prolonged fasting, HIIT training exercise, and they do, I call the triad. It's like the triad of burnout, over restricting calories, over caffeinating, and over exercising. And it's just like, and then they're stressed, right? And so for those individuals specifically, if you can't modulate some of those factors with lifestyle, you're likely going to set yourself up, and you're doing low carb, you're likely going to set yourself up for a leptin depletion, or a leptin plummet. And at that time, the body goes from regulatory function, from that impact of our parasympathetic, where we're getting our reproductive health optimized, our metabolic health optimized, our sleep cycles optimized, to true reactive. And so the system starts to kind of go in a distress mode. And many women with their periods will see breakthrough bleeding. They'll go into hypothalamic amenorrhea, meaning they lose their cycle completely, or they'll have heavy 9-12 day bleed outs. And it very depends on their progesterone and estrogen. And progesterone is very heavily driven by the pituitary, which is that P of the HPA axis. So there's so much depth. There's a whole episode within this, but I hope that kind of lays the story.
Yep.
And the idea is that carb cycling post-ovulation, which is going to have hormonal changes where progesterone is picking up. That's the idea that if you had a fertilized egg, progesterone is going to thicken the uterine tissue to make a nice home for that fertilized egg to grow. And that's one of the big drivers of preventing miscarriage, is optimized progesterone. And so post-ovulation, progesterone is supposed to pick up. And then also at days 1 and 2 of our cycle, because our body is under more mechanical stress and hormonal stress in that breaking of the uterine lining, and that being just more of an inflammatory mechanism. And so what I generally start with women is carb cycling after they've been keto for a solid 2 months. And so I generally get them keto adapted first, because I find it to be a little bit too much of like an emotional cat and mouse game if you bring it in right away. So I like to go probably 2 months. Some people, if they have more than 40% body fat, they might be able to stay keto type for 6 months. But it really is going to depend on body fat composition and then the stress and the exercise component. But generally speaking, we carb cycle at like days 19 and 20 for a 28-day cycling woman, and then at days 1 and 2. So it's kind of in that second, third, and the beginning of the cycle. And what that would look like is 30 in the way that I use it in my clinic and personally is about 30 to 45 grams of carbs in the evening. So that also does help a little bit with the serotonin reset, and melatonin is made from serotonin, as we may know. So there is an impact of the evening time, and that being at higher demand as melatonin levels rise. And the big thing is that leptin as a hormone is insulinogenic. So you want a little bit of an insulin peak to help to tell the body like, hey, Allie, we're feeding you. We're all good. We're not starving. We don't have to shut down hormone production. This is a good place. And then we typically follow that intuitively with like a morning fast and then go on with the day, and then one more evening of the same. And so it could look like half a cup of roasted sweet potato. We still keep it very paleo. So it could be half a cup of roasted sweet potato with coconut oil and chili powder with our sirloin steak and our asparagus. And then that evening meal may have a cup of strawberries with some avocado cacao mousse that we used a couple dates to sweeten. And so it could be 30 to 45 grams of carbs on top of your total 30 grams of carbs of your standard diet, give or take. And again, some women I liberalize to 45 grams of carbs total once they've been keto adapted.
It's pretty minimal. It's not a massive amount of carbohydrate at all.
Yeah, some people that do carb ups or carb cycling go 150, and I can't imagine. We stay under 90. 90 is my upper limit of a carb cycle.
Interesting. So obviously you're doing tremendous amounts of intervention therapy with nutrition and with supplements. Any other environmental considerations or any other any interventions you're executing that aren't dietary or supplemental? So if there's any mindfulness practices or any environmental considerations you're making to help people with these psychological issues or anxiety issues or anything like that?
Getting outside.
Yeah.
It's huge. So beyond breath and sleep, which is huge, and we get so much neuroregenerative function with sleep. But getting outside and actually earthing or grounding, I mean, the earth is the biggest battery charge that we have available to us.
Right.
It blew my mind. My husband used to install solar panels before he started working for my clinic, Naturally Nourished. And he's like, yeah, babe, do you know that like when we say there's a ground wire, that there's literally a rod stuck in the earth, and like that's what like our refrigerator is connected to? I was like, I don't know. It was such a simple like visual where it's like, oh man, that's how we're floating in this universe, is based on that big charge battery.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I think that's just an awesome practice, whether that means laying outside, not on a yoga mat, which might have plastic, which would separate us from that, but getting ground energy, camping, playing in the mud, beyond the biome and the soil-based organisms and some of that cool stuff that we get. Just connecting with wonder and nature, I think, is those cyclical rhythms that the body craves and needs to just rebound. I think are absolutely essential.
I love it. That's a huge part of that conversation I had with Gerald Pollack, is talking about the whole negative charge that's necessary, and that's effectively what the structured water is. The result of the negative charge is this structured water, which envelops every one of our cells in our body. So just by inhaling it, I'm seeing such a difference in my energy and my clarity. And it's something definitely you want to look into.
Cool.
Ali, you're amazing. I'm going to read your book.
Awesome.
1,000%. I'm gonna promote it, and when it comes out officially to the public, you let me know, and I'll be an advocate to get behind you. So,
fantastic.
Gosh, I wish we could talk longer, but I'm so grateful that we got to connect.
This is so fun. It's my pleasure.
An amazing wealth of knowledge, Ali Miller. Where can everybody find more from you?
So everything is at alimillerrd.com. So just alimillerrd.com. And then on Instagram and all the social media, it's at alimillerrd. And I have a podcast called Naturally Nourished.
I love it. And we're going to link to all that stuff in the show notes and on the website. So thank you so much, Ali. I do appreciate you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It was so much fun.
All right, everybody, that's a wrap for the podcast with Ali Miller. I hope you absolutely enjoyed it. Ali is an integrative functional dietitian, living the lifestyle. And as you can hear, she has an incredible understanding, a lot of these intricate interactions of DNA, of genetic expression, of supplements, and how those are going to influence these things that we talked about, from the HPA axis to the brain to the gut. Really, really great conversation. I hope you loved it. And I hope you love all the podcasts we do. And if you did, again, I would love it if you shared this with somebody. I'm getting such incredible, overwhelming feedback literally every single day. So I want to express gratitude for you guys for being part of this mission. And head over to Amazon and pick up Ali's book, because we love to support people who are doing great stuff. She's obviously out there spending a lot of her great time researching and trying to help us. And, we can't, myself included, can't live this life of spending hours and hours and hours a day researching without your support. So I'm going to go out and buy books for Ali, and to support Ali, I probably will be doing a giveaway of one of her books to someone who heads over to Amazon, leaves a review for Ali after buying her book. And if you want to tag me in your Instagram post, just a picture or review of her book or whatever it is, I'm going to be giving some giveaways to anyone who does that over the next couple of weeks. So I hope you guys enjoy the show. And as always, live your greatest life in your greatest body.
Join us on benpakulski.com to learn the cutting-edge techniques to take control of your body, your brain, and create your greatest life.
This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Ben Pakulski and the producers, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.